Let's get started. Story number 1.
It was the summer of 2019 when I moved into my new apartment in a quiet corner of a city I didn't know well. I had just landed a job at a law firm and was starting fresh after moving away from my hometown. The apartment building was old, built in the 1940s, and had a certain charm. High ceilings, vintage tile in the kitchen, and wooden floors that creaked with every step you took. The landlord, a woman named Grace, seemed nice enough, though she was a bit on edge when I signed the lease. "It's a peaceful place," she told me, offering a tight smile. "Just don't disturb the neighbors, and they won't disturb you." I thought nothing of it. It was a simple one-bedroom unit, and I was thrilled to finally have a space of my own. I moved in and spent the first few days unpacking, getting accustomed to the creaks and groans of the old building, which was to be expected. The elevator was small and slow, and the halls smelled faintly of dust and old wood. The apartment had a cozy feel to it, and I was happy to settle in. It started small. The first time I noticed something was off was a few days after I had moved in. I was sitting on the couch reading when I heard faint tapping from the direction of the kitchen. At first, I thought it was just the pipes making noise, but then it started again. Tap, 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 like something was lightly knocking on the wall. I stood up and walked into the kitchen, but there was nothing there. I checked the cabinets and the sink, but everything seemed fine. It was a bit strange, but I convinced myself it was just the house settling. Older buildings had quirks, right? A few nights later, I woke up around 3 a.m. to a faint sound. Again, the tapping. It was louder this time, like someone was knocking on the inside of the walls. I turned over, half-heartedly, hoping it would stop, but it didn't. The sound seemed to get closer, moving from the kitchen to the wall next to my bed. My heart began to race. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, thinking there might be something in the walls. A rodent, maybe? But when I shone the light around the room, nothing was there. I sat in bed, staring at the wall, wondering what the hell was going on. The next morning, I mentioned it casually to Grace, the landlord. She looked at me, her expression unreadable, before her lips parted. "You heard it too, didn't you?" she said softly. I stared at her, confused. "What do you mean?" "The tapping," she replied. It's not a rat. It's a thing that happens in this building. I've heard it too, as have other tenants. It's best not to talk about it too much. Some things are better left alone." She said it with such finality that I couldn't bring myself to press further. I thanked her and left it at that, but the unease lingered. That night, the tapping continued, this time louder and more persistent than ever. It felt like something or someone was trying to get my attention. The following days were a blur of restless nights, interrupted by tapping from the walls. I couldn't sleep, couldn't focus. It was driving me to the edge of my sanity. I spent most of my time at work, trying to avoid the apartment and whatever strange presence seemed to haunt it. But it wasn't just the noise. It was the feeling that something was in the apartment with me. When I would get home late, I would sometimes catch the faintest glimpse of something in the corner of my eye, a shadow flickering past the doorway. But when I turned to look, nothing was there. The apartment that once felt cozy now felt suffocating, like a heavy blanket smothering me. I was constantly on edge. One evening, after a particularly long day at work, I returned to the apartment and collapsed on the couch. I was so exhausted I didn't even bother to turn on the lights. But then I heard it again, the tapping. It came from the wall next to me, as if something was desperately trying to get my attention. I jumped up from the couch and grabbed a flashlight, determined to find the source of the noise. I pointed the beam toward the wall, but there was nothing. I scanned the room, the beam bouncing off the furniture, the walls, the floor, but there was no sign of anything unusual. The tapping continued, now so loud I could almost feel it in my chest. It seemed to be moving, circling around the walls of the apartment, like it was following me. I could feel the walls closing in around me, my breath quickening as I stumbled toward the door. "Stop it," I shouted into the empty room. "What do you want?" As soon as the words left my mouth, the tapping stopped. Dead silence. For a moment, I stood there, frozen, like unsure of what to do. The air felt thick and charged, like something was about to happen. I glanced at the wall where the tapping had come from. To my horror, there was a faint impression of a handprint on the wall. Faint, but unmistakable. My blood ran cold. I couldn't stay there any longer. I grabbed my things and ran out of the apartment, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't care about the rent, the lease, or anything else. I had to get out. I went to a nearby cafe and sitting there for hours, trying to calm myself. It was only after a few hours of pacing and trying to shake the dread that I began to think clearly again. Something wasn't right in that building. The tapping, the shadows, the handprint. It was all too much to ignore. I returned to the apartment early the next morning to collect the rest of my things. The landlord was there, waiting for me. She looked at me with a knowing expression. I was half expecting her to offer me some explanation, some comforting words, but instead she simply handed me an envelope. "This is for you," she said quietly. "It's better if you read it when you leave." I didn't hesitate. I took the envelope and left without saying another word. Outside, I opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, yellowed with age, written in neat cursive handwriting. It read, "The thing that lives in the walls does not want to be disturbed. It has been here long before any of us. Those who have come before you have heard it too. It waits. It waits for someone to listen. But once you listen, you cannot escape." My blood ran cold as I read the words. The tapping, the shadows. It wasn't just some weird occurrence. It was something that had been there all along, something waiting, watching for someone to listen. I never went back to that apartment. I don't know if anyone else has moved in or if the noise continues. All I know is that I left the city, never looking back. I never told anyone the full truth about what happened in that apartment, and to this day I haven't told a soul about the paper I found. But I will never forget the tapping.
Story number 2.
I moved to the small town of Weston in the fall of 2017. My new job had brought me there, and after weeks of searching for an affordable place, I found a modest one-bedroom apartment in an old building near the town square. It wasn't a glamorous place, but it had a certain charm to it. The floors creaked, the windows rattled when the wind blew, but it felt like it had character. The landlord, a woman named Mrs. Carter, was a quiet, older lady who was friendly but didn't offer much in the way of conversation. She showed me around the building, mentioning that the place had been around for decades, even passed through generations of families. "It's an old building," she said with a shrug, "but it's home to some good people." I took her word for it and signed the lease. I didn't think much about it. The building had history, yes, but in a small town like Weston, history was part of the landscape. The first few weeks went by without incident. I unpacked, set up my furniture, and adjusted to the quiet pace of life in a small town. It wasn't exactly what I had imagined for myself, but there was a simplicity to it that I appreciated. It was a stark contrast to the busy city life I had grown accustomed to. However, after a while, things began to change. It started with the temperature. I'm not talking about drafts or the usual chill of an old building. This was different. The temperature in my apartment fluctuated oddly. One night, I would wake up to find my breath visible in the cold air, and the next, I would sweat in the heat. But the worst part was the persistent cold spots. I would be sitting in my living room, the heater running, and suddenly a cold breeze would pass through the room, chilling me to the bone. I could never figure out where it came from. It was as if someone had opened a window, but every time I checked, the windows were closed. I tried to ignore it, chalking it up to the quirks of an old building. But as the weeks went on, the occurrences became more frequent, and they began to grow more unsettling. One evening, after a long day of work, I returned home to find that the light in the hallway had been left on. I was sure I had turned it off when I left, but maybe I'd just forgotten. It wasn't that big of a deal, so I went about my usual routine. However, later that night, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard a soft sound coming from the hallway. It was a tapping, almost like fingernails against wood. At first, I thought it was the pipes or the wind, but the tapping continued, growing louder and more insistent. My heart began to race as the sound seemed to move closer. It felt like something was walking down the hall toward my bedroom. I sat in bed, frozen, listening. The tapping stopped just outside my door. I wanted to get up and check, but a deep sense of unease kept me still. I thought about calling Mrs. Carter, but I quickly dismissed the idea. What would I say? That I thought there was someone outside my door tapping on the walls in the middle of the night? The next day, I found a message on the wall of the hallway. It was written in faint, almost imperceptible scratches, but I could make out the words clearly. Get out. I felt my stomach churn. My mind raced, trying to come up with a rational explanation. Had someone broken in? Was this some kind of sick prank? But the door had been locked, and there was no sign of forced entry. The odd occurrences continued. The noises grew louder at night. Footsteps pacing across the floor above me, whispers I couldn't quite understand. I began to feel like I was never truly alone in the apartment, as if something or someone was always just out of sight, watching me. I started avoiding the hallway after dark, convinced that the strange cold spots were more than just a draft. I knew I had to get to the bottom of it, but the thought of confronting whatever was in that apartment made me hesitant. One afternoon, I decided to visit Mrs. Carter and ask her if there had been any reports of strange happenings in the building. I wasn't sure what I expected her to say, but her response was not what I anticipated. "Ah, you've noticed it, haven't you?" she said, her eyes distant as she set down her teacup. "I was hoping you wouldn't, but it's been years since someone stayed long enough to feel it. The building has its history." I was stunned. "What do you mean? History?" She sighed, her eyes flickering with something I couldn't quite place. "This building has been here for a long time. A lot of people have lived here, and some of them never really left." She didn't elaborate, but the implication hung in the air. I asked her if she had experienced anything strange, and she didn't deny it. Instead, she told me stories about the building's past, about the woman who had lived in the apartment before me, a young artist who had mysteriously disappeared without a trace. The rumors had always been that she had been involved with a local man who, after her disappearance, had become increasingly disturbed, even claiming to hear her voice in the halls. Eventually, he left the town, but the apartment was never the same. "That's the thing about old buildings," Mrs. Carter continued, her voice low. "They hold on to things, and sometimes those things don't go away." I left her office feeling a mix of disbelief and growing unease. Was it possible that the building was haunted? Was I really experiencing what I thought I was? I decided to dig deeper into the history of the place. I went to the local library looking for old town records, anything that could shed light on what might be happening in the building. I came across an old newspaper clipping from the 1950s. It was an obituary detailing the death of a woman who had lived in the building. She had passed away under mysterious circumstances. No foul play was ever confirmed, but there were rumors of strange occurrences leading up to her death. The obituary ended with a chilling line. Her family never spoke of her again. That night, as I sat in my living room, I noticed something strange. The air in the room had become unusually cold again, and the whispering started up once more. But this time, it wasn't just random murmurs. I could clearly hear a voice calling my name. It was soft at first, almost a whisper, but it grew louder and more urgent. I got up to investigate, following the sound toward the hallway. As I passed the bathroom door, I caught a glimpse of something in the mirror, a figure standing just behind me. I froze, my heart racing. But when I turned around, no one was there. The hallway was empty. I tried to convince myself it was my imagination, but the feeling of being watched never left. That night, I decided to leave the apartment for good. I packed my things quickly, feeling the weight of something oppressive in the air. As I stepped out the door, I heard the tapping again, coming from the other side of the hallway. But this time, I didn't stop to listen. I ran. I never returned to that apartment, and I moved out of Weston shortly after. It's been years now, but I still think about that place. About the whispers, the cold spots, the scratching on the walls. I can't shake the feeling that something is still there, waiting for the next person to move in, to hear the tapping, to feel the presence. The building is still there, still standing, but I don't think I'll ever be able to forget the way it made me feel. Whatever haunted that place never left, and I suspect it never will.
Story number 3.
I never believed in ghosts, at least not in any serious way. Growing up, I had always heard stories, but I figured they were just that, stories. Fiction. Tales spun by people who wanted to explain the unexplainable. But all that changed in 2017 when I moved into an old duplex in the middle of downtown Boise, Idaho. I was 26 and had just landed a new job at a tech company far away from my family in Texas. The duplex was charming with its red brick exterior and tall windows. I immediately loved it. It had this rustic charm and felt like it had character, unlike the cookie-cutter apartments I'd seen in other areas of the city. The landlord, an older woman named Margaret, had been living in the other half of the duplex for as long as anyone could remember. She was friendly but a little strange. There was always a far-off look in her eyes when we talked. She mentioned that the place had been in her family for generations, which I thought was sweet. The first few weeks went by without incident. I spent most of my time at work, coming home late at night to crash on the couch. It was a quiet neighborhood, and everything felt fine. However, I started noticing small things that were just a bit off. It began one evening when I was on the phone with my mom. I had just gotten back from the store, and as I unpacked the groceries, I noticed the light in the hallway flickering. I thought it was probably a faulty bulb, but as I got closer to the switch, it flickered again, and then it went out completely. I cursed under my breath and went to grab a replacement bulb. When I came back, the light was on again, bright as day. I chalked it up to electrical issues and didn't give it much thought. The second occurrence happened about a week later. I was lying in bed, reading a book, when I heard the sound of footsteps. Soft, deliberate steps, as if someone was walking slowly across the wooden floor in the living room. I paused, listening closely, but the sound stopped. I got out of bed, checked the living room, and found nothing. There were no open windows or doors, nothing that could explain the noise. I stood there for a few moments, wondering if maybe it was just the house settling. I went back to bed, shaking my head at how easily I had spooked myself. But then it started happening more often. The footsteps, always in the middle of the night, pacing back and forth in the living room. Sometimes I would wake up to the faintest sound of someone whispering just out of reach, words I could never quite make out. At first, I tried to ignore it. I told myself it was just the house settling, or the wind, or maybe the creaks of the building's old frame. But as the weeks went by, I couldn't deny the unsettling pattern. One night, the whispers were louder than usual. I woke up to them clearly now, just behind my ear, so soft that I couldn't make out the words. But the tone was unmistakable, pleading, desperate, like someone was trying to get my attention. My heart pounded in my chest, and I sat up, looking around in the dark. The room was still. I turned on my lamp, my hands shaking slightly, but the room appeared empty. I grabbed my phone, checked the time. It was 3:15 a.m. I figured it was just a bad dream or my imagination getting the best of me. But when I turned to reach for my blanket, my eyes caught something in the corner of the room. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the lamp. But as my eyes adjusted, I realized it wasn't a shadow. There, standing at the edge of the room, was a figure. It was thin, shrouded in a dark mist with no discernible features, just a tall, formless silhouette. My heart raced, and for a long moment I couldn't move. I blinked, and the figure was gone. I jumped out of bed, my legs unsteady as I rushed to check the rest of the apartment. Everything was normal. No one there, nothing unusual. Still, the feeling lingered. I had to get some air. I grabbed my jacket and went outside for a walk. As I walked through the quiet streets of the neighborhood, I tried to shake off what I had seen, convincing myself it was just a nightmare. Or my mind playing tricks on me. I returned to the apartment, but the unease stayed with me. The next day, I mentioned the incident to Margaret. Her reaction was strange, almost too calm. "Oh, honey, I'm sorry," she said with a soft sigh. "The house is just old, and some things from the past tend to hang around. You'll get used to it." I was caught off guard by her response. I thought she was just joking, but there was something in her voice that made me uneasy. Still, I didn't press her on it. That night, things escalated. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of the whispers again, this time louder and clearer, but still unintelligible. I shot up in bed, my heart pounding. The room was dark, save for the dim light coming from the street lamp outside. But then as my eyes adjusted, I saw it. There, standing at the foot of my bed, was the figure again, just like before. Only this time, it was closer. its presence more solid, like it was leaning in toward me. I could feel its weight in the room, and I froze, unable to move. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, like they were coming from all around me. Help me. I heard, but the voice was not just one voice. It was a chorus of voices, layered over each other, as though dozens of people were speaking at once. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. It felt as though the room was closing in around me. The figure reached out, and in that moment, I could hear the unmistakable sound of footsteps moving toward me. I slammed my eyes shut, praying it was all just a nightmare. When I opened my eyes again, the figure was gone. The room was silent, and the weight in the air lifted. I lay there for what felt like hours, too terrified to move. The next morning, I packed up my things and left the apartment. I didn't care that I had signed a lease. I couldn't stay there another night. Margaret didn't seem surprised when I told her I was leaving. Some people just can't handle it, she said, her voice almost too gentle. It's not for everyone. As I moved my things out, I saw her standing in the doorway, watching me. For the first time, I realized she had never really told me what happened in that apartment, why she'd seemed so uneasy, why she had never mentioned anything about the history of the place. I never found out. I never went back. Sometimes I still hear those whispers at night when the world is still and the air is heavy with memories, and every time I remember the shadow, the figure that stood in the corner of my room, and the voices that pleaded for help. Story the end.
Story number 4.
Here's a full-length scary story for you. Sam and Elena had just moved into their new home, a modest 2-bedroom house in a small town in the Pacific Northwest. It wasn't much, but it was theirs, and they were eager to start their life together. The house was a little dated. Its wood-paneled walls and creaky floorboards bore the marks of decades past. It sat at the edge of a dense forest, the kind that blanketed the landscape in a shadowy calm, even on sunny days. It was the fall of 2016 when they moved in, and the weather was already shifting. Rain came in waves, tapping against the windows at night, creating an oddly soothing rhythm. For the first few weeks, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. They unpacked boxes, hung up curtains, and painted the walls to give the place their own flair. The first oddity happened one rainy evening when Elena came home from work. Sam worked late shifts at a local bar, so she often had the house to herself in the evenings. That night, as she settled into the couch with a book, she heard what sounded like faint footsteps upstairs. She froze, straining to listen. "Sam?" she called out, though she knew he wouldn't be home for hours. No response. She shrugged it off, chalking it up to the old house settling in the rain. But as the minutes passed, the sound came again. Slow, deliberate steps moving across the ceiling. Elena set her book down and cautiously climbed the stairs. The hallway light flickered as she reached the top. Her breath caught in her throat when she saw that the door to the guest bedroom was ajar. They hadn't used that room since moving in. The boxes they hadn't unpacked yet were still stacked neatly inside, untouched. "Elena, you're being ridiculous," she muttered to herself, shaking her head. She pushed the door open wider, revealing the darkened room. Nothing was out of place. She exhaled a shaky laugh and turned to leave. Then the door slammed shut behind her. Elena screamed and fumbled for the doorknob, yanking it open and bolting down the stairs. She didn't stop until she was outside in the rain, heart hammering in her chest. She called Sam and begged him to come home early, but when he arrived, there was nothing out of the ordinary. "You probably imagined it," Sam said, though he didn't look entirely convinced. But the next night, it was Sam who heard the footsteps. He was in the kitchen, heating up leftovers, when the sound began. He immediately froze, glancing toward the staircase. "Elena?" he called, but she was still at work. The footsteps grew louder, descending the stairs this time. Sam grabbed a kitchen knife and cautiously moved toward the noise. When he reached the bottom of the staircase, the sound stopped abruptly. The air felt heavier, like a static charge before a lightning strike. Sam stood there for several moments, his heart pounding. Then, just as he turned to leave, he heard a whisper, low and guttural, coming from directly behind him. "Get out!" He spun around, but no one was there. Over the following weeks, the occurrences became more frequent. Lights flickered, doors opened and closed on their own, and the sound of footsteps became a nightly event. Sam and Elena began sleeping with the lights on, but even that didn't help. They both started hearing whispers in the dead of night, unintelligible but deeply unnerving. One evening, Elena decided to do some research on the house. She spent hours combing through old newspaper archives and town records. What she found sent chills down her spine. The house had once belonged to a man named Thomas Grayson, who had lived there with his wife and young daughter in the 1970s. One night, in a fit of rage, Thomas had murdered his family and then taken his own life. The bodies weren't discovered for weeks. Elena showed the article to Sam, and they both sat in stunned silence. "That explains a lot," Sam said finally, though his voice trembled. But knowing the history didn't make living there any easier. If anything, the activity grew more intense. They started waking up with bruises they couldn't explain. Objects were thrown across the room with invisible force. The whispers turned into full sentences. "Leave now," the voice hissed one night as they lay in bed. The temperature in the room dropped suddenly, their breaths visible in the dim light. Terrified, they decided to call in a local paranormal investigator, a woman named Margaret, who had a reputation for helping people in similar situations. When Margaret arrived, she immediately sensed something dark. "This isn't just a haunting," she said grimly. "There's something malevolent here." Margaret conducted a cleansing ritual, burning sage and chanting prayers. For a moment, the house seemed calm, but then the air grew heavy again, and the sound of shattering glass echoed through the house. "Get out!" a voice screamed, loud and clear, as every door in the house slammed shut simultaneously. Margaret turned to Sam and Elena, her face pale. "You need to leave," she said. "Now!" They didn't need to be told twice. They packed a few essentials and left that night, staying at a motel until they could figure out what to do. The next morning, they returned to the house to gather more of their belongings. But when they walked inside, they found the walls scratched with deep, jagged marks. The words, "You're not welcome," were etched into the living room wall, carved as if by clawed hands. That was the last straw. They put the house on the market, disclosing the paranormal activity to the next potential buyer. It sat unsold for months, a dark shadow among the neighborhood. To this day, Sam and Elena refuse to talk about what happened in that house. But late at night, when the rain taps against the windows of their new apartment, Elena sometimes wonders if they ever truly left it behind, or if something followed them. Story the end.
Story number 5.
Here's the story. In the fall of 2017, Ava Wright moved into an old Victorian house in a quiet suburb of New Jersey. It wasn't her first choice, but she had to downsize quickly after her divorce, and the house was a steal for its size. The realtor, an older man with a nervous smile, had glossed over the property's history. The previous owners just moved out, he said, avoiding her gaze. It's a beautiful home. The house, painted a dull gray with chipping trim, had an eerie charm. It had high ceilings, creaky hardwood floors, and stained glass windows that cast strange, fractured light across the walls. Ava, an artist, found inspiration in its haunting beauty, though her teenage daughter Lily wasn't as thrilled. "This place is creepy," Lily had said on their first night, standing in the narrow hallway on the second floor. Ava had laughed it off, attributing her daughter's unease to teenage dramatics. But the strangeness began almost immediately. On their third night, Ava was in the living room, sketching by the light of a flickering lamp, when she heard the sound of footsteps upstairs. At first, she thought it was Lily, but a quick glance at the sofa confirmed her daughter was fast asleep, headphones in, phone clutched in her hand. The footsteps were deliberate and slow, as if someone were pacing back and forth. Ava's stomach tightened, and her heart raced as she crept up the stairs, her phone flashlight slicing through the darkness. The hallway was empty, but the air felt heavy, charged with something she couldn't explain. She dismissed it as old house noises. "This place just needs some work," she muttered to herself. But the house had more than creaks and groans. Objects began to move. A glass vase Ava had placed on the kitchen counter one morning was on the dining room table by evening. Picture frames tilted at odd angles even when she adjusted them. Lily's books would be stacked neatly one moment and scattered across the floor the next. One night, Lily burst into Ava's room, pale and trembling. "Mom, someone was in my room," she whispered, her voice shaking. "What are you talking about?" Ava asked, sitting up. I woke up and there was a woman standing in the corner. She was just staring at me. Ava's first instinct was to comfort her daughter. You must have been dreaming, she said. But when she checked Lily's room, the air was freezing, and the faint scent of lavender lingered, a smell that didn't belong to either of them. As the weeks went on, the activity escalated. Ava started hearing whispers late at night, soft voices she couldn't quite make out. She tried recording the sounds on her phone, but the playback was always silent. Lily refused to sleep in her room, opting instead for the couch downstairs. One evening, while sorting through boxes in the attic, Ava found an old photo album hidden beneath a loose floorboard. The album was filled with sepia-toned photographs of a family, a stern-looking man, a delicate woman with dark eyes, and 2 young boys. On the last page, written in faded ink, was the name The Dunhams and the year 1923. Curiosity turned to unease when Ava flipped to the final photo. It showed the woman standing on the front porch of the house, her eyes boring into the camera. Ava recognized her instantly. She was the same woman Lily had described seeing in her room. That night, Ava did something she hadn't done in years. She prayed. The following day, she visited the local library to dig into the house's history. What she found made her blood run cold. The Dunhams had lived in the house for over 2 decades. In 1923, the mother, Margaret Dunham, had suffered a breakdown after the death of her youngest son in a drowning accident. Consumed by grief, she poisoned her husband and surviving son before taking her own life in the upstairs bedroom, Lily's room. Ava left the library with a weight in her chest. She wanted to leave, but financial constraints made it impossible. Instead, she turned to a local paranormal investigator, a man named Tom Carter, who specialized in cleansing homes. Tom arrived with an assortment of tools, sage, candles, and a recorder to capture electronic voice phenomena, EVPs. As he walked through the house, his expression grew more serious. There's definitely a presence here, he said. It's not just residual energy. It's intelligent. When he entered Lily's room, he stopped abruptly. She's here, he murmured. He set up his recorder and asked, Margaret, are you with us? The room seemed to vibrate with tension, and the temperature dropped sharply. After a few moments of silence, the recorder picked up a faint, chilling whisper. Leave. Tom advised Ava and Lily to stay elsewhere for a few days while he performed a cleansing ritual. They checked into a nearby motel, but Ava couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Margaret's face. When they returned, the house was quieter, but not for long. The activity resumed, more aggressive than before. Doors slammed shut on their own. Lily woke up with scratches on her arms. Ava began having vivid nightmares of drowning, waking up gasping for air. One night, Ava awoke to find Margaret standing at the foot of her bed, her dark eyes filled with sorrow. Ava froze, unable to move or scream. Margaret raised a hand and pointed toward the attic before vanishing. The next morning, Ava climbed to the attic with trembling hands. In the same spot where she'd found the photo album, she discovered a small box. Inside was a letter written by Margaret. It was a confession, detailing her descent into madness and her regrets. The final line read, "Forgive me. I only wanted to keep them safe." Ava burned the letter in the fireplace that night, tears streaming down her face. She spoke aloud, addressing Margaret. "I forgive you. You don't have to stay here anymore." The house was quiet after that. The air felt lighter, the shadows less menacing. Ava and Lily still moved out a few months later, but they left with a strange sense of peace. Years later, Ava would look back on that time with a mix of terror and pity. The house had been a prison, not just for them, but for Margaret as well. And while she couldn't explain everything that happened, she hoped Margaret had finally found the release she so desperately needed.
Story number 6.
In the summer of 2018, Lily moved into an old duplex in Cleveland, Ohio. It wasn't her dream home, but with her recent promotion, she needed to be closer to the office, and the rent was reasonable. The neighborhood was quiet, full of aging houses with sagging porches and peeling paint, but it felt safe enough. Her unit was small but functional. The previous tenant had left behind a few odd items, a rusted coat rack, an old mirror with a cracked frame, and, in the basement, a child's rocking chair. It struck Lily as odd, but she didn't dwell on it. The first few weeks were uneventful. Lily spent her time unpacking, arranging furniture, and settling into her new routine. She worked late most evenings and spent her weekends curled up on the couch binge-watching shows. But soon, strange things began happening. One night, as Lily was brushing her teeth, she heard faint tapping on the bathroom window. She froze, toothbrush in hand, and stared at the glass. Her bathroom was on the second floor, overlooking a small alley. There was no way someone could be outside the window. The tapping came again, 3 soft, deliberate knocks. She turned off the light and peered through the blinds. Nothing but darkness stared back at her. She shrugged it off, convincing herself it was a tree branch or some kind of animal, and went to bed. The next morning, she found her kitchen cabinets wide open. Every single door, every single drawer, open. She didn't remember leaving them that way, but she reasoned that she must have been absent-minded the night before. But it happened again, and again. By the third morning, she was certain something was wrong. The cabinets weren't just open, they were rearranged. Cups and plates had been taken out and stacked in neat, precarious towers on the counter. Her silverware drawer was completely empty, its contents scattered across the floor. Lily started double-checking the locks on her doors and windows, but everything was always secure. Still, the strange occurrences continued. Lights flickered even when there was no storm. Her phone would randomly die despite being fully charged. And then there were the footsteps. Late at night, when Lily was lying in bed, she'd hear them. Slow, deliberate steps coming from the hallway outside her room. At first, she thought it was her upstairs neighbor, but the duplex was side by side, not stacked. There shouldn't have been anyone above her. The footsteps started happening more frequently, and they always stopped just outside her bedroom door. One night, mustering her courage, Lily yanked the door open to confront whatever or whoever was there. The hallway was empty. The final straw came in September. Lily had been working late on a Friday and got home just after midnight. Exhausted, she dropped her bag by the door and kicked off her shoes, heading straight to the kitchen for a glass of water. As she flipped on the light, her heart sank. The rocking chair from the basement was in the middle of the kitchen. She hadn't touched it since moving in. Her hands shook as she picked up her phone and called her friend Danielle. "I think someone's in my house," she whispered, glancing around. Danielle promised to come over immediately, but before she could arrive, Lily heard the sound of the chair creaking. It began rocking back and forth on its own, the faint squeak of the old wood filling the silent kitchen. Lily backed out of the room, her pulse pounding. She locked herself in the bathroom and waited for Danielle. When Danielle arrived, they searched the house together. Every door and window was locked. The basement was empty, save for a few old boxes. But when they went back upstairs, the rocking chair was no longer in the kitchen. It was back in the basement, exactly where it had been before. "Lily, you need to leave this place," Danielle said, her voice trembling. Lily wanted to leave, but breaking her lease wasn't an option. She decided to spend the next few nights at Danielle's apartment while she figured out what to do. That weekend, Danielle convinced Lily to look into the history of the duplex. They found an article buried deep in an online archive. In 1987, a woman named Eleanor Turner had lived in the house with her 6-year-old daughter, Molly. One night, after a bitter custody battle, Eleanor had taken Molly's life and then her own. The neighbors had reported hearing strange sounds for weeks afterward, crying, footsteps, and the creaking of a rocking chair. Lily felt a chill run down her spine. When she returned to the duplex to pack some belongings, she found the rocking chair in the middle of the living room. On it was a single sheet of paper, yellowed and brittle, with the words, "Mommy, please stop," scrawled in shaky, childlike handwriting. Terrified, Lily left and never went back. She broke her lease, forfeiting her deposit, and moved into a small apartment across town. Months later, she drove past the old duplex out of morbid curiosity. It looked the same, but she noticed a "For Rent" sign in the front yard. She pulled over and asked the man hammering the sign into the ground about the previous tenants. "Didn't last long," he said with a shrug. "No one ever does in this place. It's got a reputation." As Lily drove away, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. When she glanced in the rearview mirror, she thought she saw a small figure standing in the window, watching her. Story the end.
Story number 7.
In the winter of 2018, Emily Reinhardt and her fiancé Daniel moved into a modest century-old farmhouse in rural Pennsylvania. The house was an impulse buy, acquired during an online auction after Daniel saw potential in its sprawling property and cheap price. The structure itself was charming, but in need of work. Emily was hesitant, but Daniel was convinced they could turn it into their dream home. The first few days passed uneventfully. The house creaked and groaned like old houses do, but Emily found its quirks endearing at first. She spent her days unpacking and organizing while Daniel worked long hours at a nearby construction site. By night, the couple shared meals by the fireplace, relishing the tranquility of country life. The peace began to unravel during their first week. One evening, Emily was in the kitchen washing dishes when she heard faint tapping on the window above the sink. She glanced up, expecting to see a tree branch swaying in the wind, but nothing was there. The tapping continued, soft but deliberate, like knuckles rapping on glass. "Must be the wind," she muttered, though she didn't fully believe it. Later that night, as she was lying in bed, Emily felt the unmistakable sensation of someone sitting on the edge of the mattress. She bolted upright, her heart pounding, but saw nothing. Daniel, exhausted from work, slept soundly beside her, oblivious to her panic. By the second week, more unsettling things began to happen. Objects moved on their own. A stack of books Emily had arranged neatly in the living room ended up scattered across the floor while she was in the shower. Doors she swore she had closed would be wide open minutes later. She often felt a chill pass through her, even when the thermostat was cranked up. The most disturbing incidents happened at night. Emily often woke to hear soft footsteps in the hallway, but when she checked, it was empty. One night, she thought she heard whispers, low, unintelligible murmurs coming from the kitchen. When she worked up the courage to investigate, she found nothing but the faint smell of something burning, though the stove was cold. Daniel was skeptical of her growing unease. "It's just an old house," he said. "They make weird noises, and you're probably just stressed from the move." But Emily couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone, that someone, or something, was watching her. She decided to confide in her best friend, Claire, who had always been interested in the paranormal. "You need to find out more about the house," Claire said over the phone. "Maybe something happened there." Emily took her advice and started digging. A visit to the local library uncovered the house's dark history. In 1927, a family of 4 had lived there: Thomas and Margaret Ellison and their 2 young daughters. According to the records, Margaret had drowned herself in the nearby creek after discovering her husband's affair. Thomas, racked with guilt, had left the property soon after, and the house had changed hands many times since. Armed with this knowledge, Emily tried to convince Daniel to take her concerns more seriously, but he remained dismissive. "You're letting your imagination run wild," he said. One night, everything came to a head. Daniel was working late, and Emily was home alone. She curled up on the couch with a blanket and a book, trying to distract herself from the growing sense of dread that had settled over the house. The wind howled outside, and the occasional groan of the house only heightened her unease. As she read, the lights flickered. She froze, clutching the book tightly, her eyes darting to the ceiling. The power surged again, and then the room plunged into darkness. Emily fumbled for her phone and turned on the flashlight. The beam of light cut through the shadows, revealing the empty room. She tried to calm her racing heart. "Just a power outage," she whispered to herself. But then she heard it. The sound of footsteps on the second floor. Slow, deliberate steps moving across the hallway. She held her breath, straining to listen. The footsteps stopped directly above her, where the master bedroom was located. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. There was no answer. Summoning her courage, she climbed the stairs, her phone's flashlight shaking in her hand. The air grew colder with each step, and by the time she reached the top, her breath was visible in the beam of light. The master bedroom door was ajar. She pushed it open with a trembling hand, her heart hammering in her chest. The room was empty, but the bed was in disarray, as though someone had been lying there moments ago. The faint scent of lavender, Margaret's favorite perfume according to her research, hung in the air. Emily backed out of the room, but as she turned to head downstairs, she saw it, a figure at the end of the hallway. It was a woman, her face pale and gaunt, her hair dripping wet. She wore a long, tattered dress, and her hollow eyes stared directly at Emily. Emily screamed and bolted down the stairs, nearly tripping in her panic. She grabbed her car keys and fled the house, not stopping until she reached the gas station down the road. She called Daniel, hysterical, begging him to come home. When Daniel arrived, he found her sitting in the car, shaking and incoherent. He drove her back to the house, assuring her they'd figure it out together. But when they stepped inside, the house felt different. The oppressive atmosphere was gone, replaced by an eerie stillness. Daniel reluctantly agreed to have a priest bless the house. For a time, the activity seemed to stop, and Emily felt a tentative sense of relief. But deep down, she knew the house's history couldn't be erased so easily. Months later, they sold the property and moved to a modern apartment in the city. Emily never spoke of the farmhouse again, but at night when she closed her eyes, she often saw the woman's hollow stare and heard the faint whisper of her name in the dark.
Story number 8.
In the winter of 2017, Rachel bought her first home, a modest ranch house in a quiet suburb of Des Moines, Iowa. The property had been on the market for several months, and Rachel's realtor explained the price drop by pointing out its outdated features and proximity to an overgrown patch of woods. Rachel didn't care. She loved the solitude, the thick pines in the backyard, and the idea of making the place her own. She moved in just after Christmas, the house still chilly despite the heater running on full blast. There was an odd draft she couldn't quite locate, but it seemed to originate from the far corner of the basement. Rachel told herself it was just the quirks of an older house and set to work settling in. The first night passed without incident, but the following evening, as she unpacked boxes in the living room, she noticed a faint smell of earth, damp and musty, drifting up from the basement. It reminded her of wet soil like after a rainstorm. She shrugged it off, deciding to check it out the next day. The basement was unfinished, just a concrete floor and walls, with a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. Rachel didn't like it down there. It felt colder than the rest of the house, the air heavy in a way that made her skin prickle. She noticed an odd stain on the floor in one corner, a dark patch that looked like it had seeped into the concrete. She ran her fingers over it. It was dry, but something about it unsettled her. She told herself it was probably an old oil spill from the previous owners. Over the next few weeks, small, strange things began to happen. Lights flickered even though the electrical system had recently been updated. Rachel would wake up in the middle of the night, convinced she'd heard footsteps in the hallway. The smell of damp earth became more frequent, wafting through the house at odd times. One night, Rachel was lying in bed, scrolling through her phone, when she heard a distinct knock, 3 sharp raps on her bedroom door. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. It was just after 2 a.m., and she was alone in the house. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. There was no response. Rachel grabbed a heavy flashlight from her nightstand and crept to the door, swinging it open. The hallway was empty. She checked every room in the house, even the basement, but found nothing out of place. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The next morning, she called her best friend, Laura, to tell her what had happened. Laura was skeptical but agreed to stay the weekend to keep Rachel company. On Saturday night, the two women sat on the couch, sipping wine and laughing about old times. Around midnight, Rachel got up to grab a blanket from the hallway closet. When she returned, Laura was staring at the basement door, her face pale. "What's wrong?" Rachel asked. "I thought I saw it move," Laura said, her voice barely above a whisper. Rachel followed her gaze to the door. It was slightly ajar, though Rachel was certain she'd closed it earlier. She walked over and pushed it shut, turning the lock for good measure. That night, they both slept in the living room, the TV on for comfort. Sometime in the early hours, Rachel woke up to the sound of soft whispers. She bolted upright, looking around the room. Laura was still asleep, but the sound was unmistakable, low, murmuring voices coming from the basement. Rachel grabbed the flashlight again and shook Laura awake. Together, they stood at the top of the basement stairs, listening. The whispers continued, just loud enough to be heard, but too faint to make out the words. "Let's call the police," Laura whispered. But Rachel hesitated. She didn't want to seem crazy, reporting voices in her basement. Instead, she worked up her courage and flipped on the light switch. The bulb flickered weakly, casting shadows that seemed to move on their own. The whispers stopped as soon as the light came on. Rachel took a step down, but Laura grabbed her arm. "Don't," she said. "Let's just leave." Rachel relented, and they spent the rest of the night at Laura's apartment. The next day, Rachel returned home alone, determined to confront whatever was happening. She decided to do some research on the house's history. What she found made her blood run cold. In 1983, the house had belonged to a man named Harold Everett, a reclusive widower who rarely left the property. Neighbors reported seeing him digging in the backyard late at night, but no one thought much of it until he vanished one day. Police eventually discovered Harold's body in the basement. He'd hanged himself, but the most disturbing part of the story was what they found buried in the woods behind the house, several shallow graves containing human remains. Investigators suspected Harold had been a serial killer, but they were never able to identify all the victims. Rachel was horrified. She started making plans to sell the house, but before she could, things escalated. That night, she was woken by the sound of her bedroom door creaking open. She sat up, heart pounding, and saw a dark figure standing in the doorway. It was tall and gaunt, its face obscured in shadow. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, the figure slowly raised an arm and pointed toward the basement. Rachel bolted from the bed, grabbed her keys, and fled the house. She drove aimlessly for hours, too scared to go back. When she finally returned the next morning, the basement door was wide open. The smell of damp earth was overwhelming, and muddy footprints led from the basement stairs to her bedroom. Rachel never spent another night in the house. She sold it at a loss and moved into a small apartment downtown. She told herself she was done with old houses, with basements, and with the past. But sometimes, late at night, she still dreams of the figure in the doorway, its arm outstretched, beckoning her to come closer. Story. The end.
Story number 9.
In the summer of 2016, Nathan and Rachel Adams, a young couple in their early 30s, purchased an old 2-story house in a quiet neighborhood in upstate New York. The house had charm, high ceilings, intricate crown molding, and a large wraparound porch. It needed work, but Nathan, an architect, saw it as a project with endless potential. They got it for a suspiciously low price, but the realtor explained the previous owner had passed away and the family was eager to sell quickly. Rachel hesitated, but was won over by Nathan's enthusiasm. They moved in during July, optimistic about the future. The first month was spent unpacking and tackling small renovations. Rachel painted the kitchen, while Nathan focused on restoring the creaky wooden floors. Everything seemed normal at first, though Rachel noticed a few oddities. The house had a persistent, musty smell no amount of cleaning could erase. She also found old objects tucked away in strange places. An antique doll stuffed behind a vent, a rusted key buried in the backyard soil, and faded Polaroids of a young boy playing on the porch. One night, as Rachel was unpacking a box in the basement, she felt a chill run down her spine. The temperature dropped sharply, and the air felt heavy. She dismissed it, thinking it was just her nerves. The basement, with its exposed pipes and dim lighting, always unsettled her. But then she heard it, a faint humming. It was soft and melodic, like a child's lullaby, and it seemed to be coming from the far corner of the room. Rachel froze, holding her breath, but the sound stopped as abruptly as it started. When she told Nathan about it later, he chuckled and teased her. "The house is old," he said. "Pipes make weird noises. You're just not used to it yet." Rachel let it go, but the humming returned, always faint, always fleeting. Over the next few weeks, other strange occurrences began to happen. Doors closed on their own, even when there was no draft. Lights flickered, though Nathan swore the wiring was fine. Items Rachel was sure she had left in one place would show up in another. The worst was the nursery. The small upstairs bedroom had been untouched since they moved in. Rachel avoided it because it felt colder than the rest of the house, even on hot summer days. She thought it was just her imagination until one night when she passed by the door and heard a faint, rhythmic creaking. It sounded like the squeak of an old rocking chair. The next morning, when she dared to look inside, the room was empty. By mid-August, Rachel's unease grew into dread. She started waking up in the middle of the night, her heart racing, convinced someone was watching her. Nathan noticed her anxiety but dismissed her fears. "You're overthinking everything," he said. "Once we finish the renovations, you'll feel better." But Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that the house didn't want them there. One night around 2 a.m., Rachel woke to the sound of soft, shuffling footsteps in the hallway. She nudged Nathan awake. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. He groggily listened but heard nothing. Rolling his eyes, he got up to check, turning on the lights as he walked down the hall. "There's nothing here," he said, annoyed, before heading back to bed. Rachel couldn't sleep after that. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening for any sound. Then she heard it, the faint humming again. This time it was louder, closer, and unmistakably coming from the nursery. Her chest tightened as she slipped out of bed. She crept toward the nursery, her bare feet cold against the hardwood floor. When she reached the door, it was ajar, though she was sure it had been closed. Pushing it open, she stepped inside. The air was freezing, her breath visible in the faint moonlight streaming through the window. And then she saw it. The rocking chair in the corner was moving, creaking slowly back and forth. There was no wind, no explanation. Rachel stumbled backward, her pulse hammering in her ears. She fled to the bedroom, shaking Nathan awake. "Something's in there," she cried. Frustrated but concerned, Nathan grabbed a flashlight and checked the room again. By the time he entered, the chair was still. The room looked as empty as ever. "It's nothing," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. Rachel wasn't convinced. The next day, she called her older sister, Lauren, who had always been fascinated by the paranormal. Lauren suggested researching the house's history. "It might give you some answers," she said. Rachel spent hours at the local library, poring over old records and newspapers. What she found horrified her. In 1974, the house had belonged to a man named Henry Mercer, a recluse known for his odd behavior. He had a son, William, who was 6 years old at the time. According to reports, William had gone missing one summer night, and though an extensive search was conducted, no trace of him was ever found. Henry had been the prime suspect, but was never charged due to lack of evidence. He died in the house a year later, reportedly by suicide. Rachel shared what she found with Nathan, who was visibly uneasy but still skeptical. "It's just a story," he said. "It doesn't mean anything." That night, Rachel couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her thoughts racing. Around 3 a.m., she heard the humming again, louder than ever before. It was joined by the faint sound of a child's laughter, echoing through the house. Her blood ran cold. Summoning every ounce of courage, Rachel grabbed her phone and tiptoed to the nursery. The door was wide open, and as she entered, the rocking chair was moving again. This time, she didn't run. Instead, she raised her phone and snapped a photo. The flash illuminated the room for a split second, and in that instant, Rachel saw him, a young boy standing by the window. His face was pale, his eyes hollow, and his expression one of profound sadness. The light vanished as quickly as it appeared, and when she looked again, the room was empty. Rachel bolted out of the nursery, her hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped her phone. When she looked at the photo, her heart sank. The boy was there, faint but unmistakable, staring straight into the camera. The next morning, Rachel showed the picture to Nathan. His face turned ashen, and for the first time, he believed her. "We need to leave," he said. They packed their belongings and moved out within a week, breaking their lease and taking a financial loss. Nathan never spoke of the house again, but Rachel kept the photo as a grim reminder of what they had experienced. Years later, Rachel sometimes wondered if William's spirit was still trapped in that house, waiting for someone to find him, to tell his story. She could only hope that someday he might find peace. Story the end.
Story number 10.
I had always been a skeptic when it came to the supernatural. I didn't believe in ghosts, spirits, or anything beyond what science could explain. That all changed in the fall of 2018 when I moved into an old two-story house in a quiet suburban neighborhood in Pennsylvania. The house was a bit of a fixer-upper, which I liked. It had character, the kind of charm you don't find in modern homes. It had been built in the 1920s, and from the moment I stepped inside, I knew it was special. The original hardwood floors, the high ceilings, the grand staircase, all of it felt like a piece of history. I was excited to get started with the renovations. I wanted to make the place my own. The first few weeks were uneventful. I worked on the house during the day and relaxed in the evenings with a good book or a movie. But there was something off about the house that I couldn't put my finger on. It wasn't anything specific, just a sense of unease that lingered in the back of my mind. It started with the noises. Late at night, I would hear faint footsteps, as if someone was walking around upstairs. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, as old houses tend to do. But the sounds became more distinct. It wasn't the creaking of floorboards. It sounded like actual footsteps, heavy and deliberate. I shrugged it off, thinking I was just imagining things. But then one night, as I was lying in bed, I heard the sound of a door creaking open. My heart raced. I was alone in the house. I had checked all the doors before going to bed, and they were all locked. I sat up, straining to listen. The door upstairs creaked open again, followed by soft footsteps on the second floor. I convinced myself it was just the wind, or maybe the house was settling in a new way. But the next night, it happened again, and the night after that. The noises weren't the only strange thing happening. One afternoon, I came home to find that one of the paintings I had hung on the wall was crooked. It was a painting I had carefully placed, and there was no way it could have moved on its own. I straightened it out, but the next morning, it was crooked again. And this time it was worse, slightly askew, as if someone had taken it down and put it back in the wrong place. I started feeling like I wasn't alone in the house. I began to notice things out of the corner of my eye, shadows flitting across the walls, brief glimpses of movement that disappeared when I turned to look. But when I checked, there was never anything there. It was always just my mind playing tricks on me, or so I tried to tell myself. Then came the dream. It was vivid, so real that it felt like I was awake. In the dream, I was walking through the house in the dark, hearing the same footsteps, the same creaking doors. But this time I wasn't alone. There was someone in the house with me, a woman standing at the top of the stairs. She was dressed in a long, old-fashioned gown, her face pale, her hair dark and pulled back. She looked down at me with eyes that seemed to pierce right through me, her lips curling into a faint, sad smile. I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding. I convinced myself it was just a bad dream, a product of stress, maybe, or my overactive imagination. But the feeling of being watched didn't go away. It lingered, even when I was awake. The next few days were a blur. I tried to focus on the renovations, but the noises grew louder. I started leaving the lights on in the house at night, and the cold spots became impossible to ignore. I would walk into a room and suddenly feel a chill, like someone had opened a window, only to find the windows were closed. I started to feel like I was being followed, like someone was always just behind me, watching my every move. One evening, I decided to take a walk around the neighborhood to clear my head. As I passed by the old cemetery at the end of the street, I saw an elderly woman sitting on a bench near the gate. She had gray hair and wore a long black dress. Something about her caught my attention. I stopped and stared, and she turned to look at me. Her eyes were dark, hollow, like she had seen things she could never forget. "Do you live in the house on Oak Street?" she asked, her voice soft but clear. I was taken aback. "Yes, I do. How did you know?" She nodded slowly, her gaze distant. "That house has a long history. It's seen a lot of people come and go, and some of them never really leave." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What do you mean?" She looked at me again, her eyes filled with sorrow. "There are spirits in that house, old ones. They've been there for years." I was about to dismiss her as a local eccentric, but there was something in her eyes that made me pause. "Who are they?" I asked, almost unwilling to hear the answer. She hesitated, her fingers twitching in her lap. "I can't say, but I wouldn't stay in that house if I were you. It's better to leave before they decide to make you one of them." I walked away quickly, not sure what to think. Was this woman just a crazy old woman with wild stories, or did she know something I didn't? Either way, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong with that house. The next few nights were the worst. The noises reached a fever pitch. The footsteps, the creaking doors, the whispers, everything was happening at once. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't think straight. I was becoming paranoid, convinced that I was losing my mind. I started recording the sounds, hoping to find an explanation, But every time I listened to the recordings, all I could hear was static, except for the faint whispers in the background. It was then that I decided to do some research on the house's history. I visited the local library and dug through old records. That's when I found the article. It was a newspaper clipping from the 1930s. The headline read, "Local woman found dead in mysterious circumstances at Oak Street house." The article detailed the death of a woman named Margaret Harris, who had lived in the house with her husband. She had been found in the basement, her body cold and lifeless, with no clear cause of death. Her husband had disappeared shortly after, and no one knew what had happened to him. The more I read, the more I realized the house had a dark history. Many people had lived there, but few had stayed for long. The rumors of hauntings, of strange occurrences, had been passed down for decades. I felt a growing sense of dread. It was as if the house itself was alive, feeding off the fear and confusion of those who lived there. The final straw came one night when I was sitting in the living room trying to relax. The lights flickered, and I heard the distinct sound of footsteps approaching. I stood up, my heart racing, and walked toward the stairs. As I reached the bottom of the staircase, I saw her again, the woman from my dream, standing at the top, staring down at me with that same sad, knowing smile. But this time it wasn't just a dream. It was real. I ran out of the house without looking back, never to return. I stayed with friends for a few weeks while I figured out what to do next. I eventually sold the house, taking a loss, but I didn't care. I couldn't shake the feeling that something in that place had been waiting for me, and that it had gotten what it wanted. To this day, I don't know who the woman was or what happened in that house, but I'll never forget the feeling of being watched, of knowing that something was just beyond my reach, lurking in the dark corners of a house that had lived through its own tragedies. I've since moved on, but I know I'll never be the same. The house on Oak Street still stands, its secrets buried in the walls, waiting for the next person to call it them. Story, the end.